Hello, welcome back to Bethel Evangelical Free Church Hanley on YouTube. I'm Pastor Gervase Charmley, and I'm here in the bookshop again to talk about another great book, one of the absolute classics. In these videos, I'm not talking about my favourite books. I'm not talking about Christian books that many people have found exciting. I'm talking about books that are very, very significant. And this set, Matthew Henry's commentary, is the first popular commentary series in English. It's the first time that someone has sat down and said, I'm going to write a commentary series in English for English-speaking people, for literate, ordinary people. Not for scholars, but for ordinary folk. It's written by Matthew Henry, who's a Welsh Presbyterian minister, although he ministered entirely in England, in Chester, and for a couple of years in Hackney. Matthew Henry was born in 1662, the year that many Puritan ministers were ejected from their pulpits up and down England and Wales. And his father was one of them. Philip Henry had been the minister of Worthenbury in North Wales, not far from Wrexham. And he was thrown out, and he had to give up the ministry and become effectively a yeoman farmer, living at his wife's inheritance, which was an estate called Broad Oak Farm, just outside Whitchurch, but on the Welsh side of the border. So Matthew Henry was born in Wales, brought up in Wales. And his father was a very godly man. He made sure that his children were brought up in the fear and admonition of the Lord. He also made sure they got a good education. And Matthew Henry was exercised for the ministry, but of course the universities, and his father had studied at university, but the universities, Oxford and Cambridge, were closed to anyone who wasn't an Anglican. And so Matthew Henry ended up studying at Gray's Inn. In other words, effectively it was law school. Now you ask the question, why would you study to law school if you're going to become a pastor? Well, at the law school you learn how to think logically, how to reason, and that was the idea. In 1689, Matthew Henry became the pastor of a little Presbyterian church in Chester, so just on the English side of the Welsh border, the city that the Welsh call Caer. And he remained there until 1712, when he took up a post in Hackney. He returned to Chester in the summer of 1713 and in the summer of 1714. It was on his way back from Chester to Hackney. He was going to preach at Nantwich and then take the coach down to London. And he had an accident. He fell off his horse. He injured himself. He didn't think it was too bad, but it turned out it was. And he died. His commentary had been begun while he was at Chester, and he worked all the way through the Old Testament at Chester. And then at Hackney, which was closer to where the printers were, he began working through the New Testament, and he got to the book of Acts, the end of the book of Acts, and had made notes on Romans by the time he died. So the commentary wasn't finished by him. It was completed by a group of ministers, friends of his, who took up his notes, his sermon notes. They spoke to his former congregation, many of whom have taken notes of his sermons, and the commentary has been an enormous bestseller. It's still in print today. How many books from the early 18th century are still in print today? Very, very few. It's in print, it's read, it's still the most celebrated English Bible commentary of all time. William Romaine said, "There is no comment on the Bible, either ancient or modern, in all respects equal to Mr. Henry's." Philip Doddridge, who himself wrote a popular commentary called the Family Expositor, said Henry's is perhaps the only commentator so large that deserves to be entirely read through. George Whitfield absolutely loved Matthew Henry. He'd read Matthew Henry on his knees, part of his daily devotions. And he says, "What a means has Henry's commentary been of building me up." Robert Hall, early 19th century Baptist, said, "I discover new beauties in him every day." And Charles Haddon Spurgeon, first among the mighty for general usefulness, he said of this commentary. So there we are, that's the introduction. Now, what about some extracts from the commentary? Well, I'll start with one of the best known, from volume 1. He's talking about the creation of Eve. And he writes, where are we? The woman was made out of a rib of the side of Adam, not made out of his head to rule over him, nor out of his feet to be trampled upon by him, but out of his side to be equal with him, under his arm to be protected, and near his heart to be beloved. Adam lost a rib, and without any diminution to his strength or comeliness, for doubtless the flesh was clothed without a scar. But in lieu thereof he had a helpmeet for him, which abundantly made up his loss. What God takes away from his people, he will, one way or another, restore with advantage. In this, as in many other things, Adam was a figure of him that was to come. For out of the side of Christ, the second Adam, his spouse, the church was formed, when he slept the deep sleep of death upon the cross, in order to which his side was opened, and there came out blood and water, blood to purchase his church, and water to purify it to himself. And it's so typical of Matthew Henry to speak like this. Once again, on Genesis 50:20, you thought evil to disappoint the dreams, but God meant it unto good, in order to the fulfilling of the dreams and the making of Joseph a greater blessing to his family than otherwise he could have been. Note, when God makes use of men's agency for the performance of his counsel, it is common for him to mean quite one thing and them another, even the quite contrary. But God's counsel shall stand. Again, God often brings good out of evil, and promotes the designs of his providence even by the sins of men. Not that he is the author of sin, far be it from us to think so, but his infinite wisdom so overrules events and directs the chain of them that even that in the issue that ends in his praise, which in its own nature had a direct tendency to his dishonour, as the putting of Christ to death. This does not make the sin the less sinful, nor sinners the less punishable, but it redounds greatly to the glory of God's wisdom. And you see, again, he always brings us back to Christ. Matthew Henry, when he's commentating on the Old Testament, he's not commentating as a Jew, he's commentating as a Christian. And modern commentaries can learn a lot from him, certainly popular level commentaries. It's one thing to talk about points of grammar, points of syntax and language, to say something about the historical background. But a popular commentary, something that's intended for reading daily by Christians, it should be a Christian commentary. Sadly, it's so common today to find even evangelical commentaries on the Old Testament that have so little of Christ in them. But Matthew Henry is all Christ, Christ, and Christ. Matthew Henry also deals with Christian experience. So, commentary on Isaiah chapter 50. He's commenting on the Isaiah 50:10. Who is among you that feareth the Lord, that obeyeth the voice of his servant, that walketh in darkness and hath no light? Let him trust in the name of the Lord, and stay upon his God. Comfort is here spoken to disconsolate saints, and they are encouraged to trust in God's grace. Here observe, firstly, what is always the character of a child of God. He is one that fears the Lord with a filial fear, that stands in awe of his majesty, and is afraid of incurring his displeasure. This is a grace that usually appears most in good people when they walk in darkness, when other graces appear not. They then tremble at his word, and are afraid of his judgments. He is one that obeys the voice of God's servant, is willing to be ruled by the Lord Jesus as God's servant in the great work of man's redemption, one that yields a sincere obedience to the law of Christ, and cheerfully comes up to the terms of his covenant. Those that truly fear God will obey the voice of Christ. He's full of comfort. He's a pastor. He's not an academic. He's a pastor. And in him we find great blessing to just read these pastoral thoughts of the love of God in Christ Jesus. And pull out the commentary on the Gospels. And on the Gospels, he speaks of the Lord. He says, on Matthew chapter 2, the wise men and Herod, we cannot expect too little from man, nor too much from God. What a transport of joy these wise men were in upon the sight of the star. None know so well as those who, after a long and melancholy night of temptation and desertion, under the power of a spirit of bondage, at length receive the spirit of adoption, witnessing with their spirits that they are the children of God. This is light out of darkness. It is life from the dead. Now they had reason to hope for a sight of the Lord's Christ speedily, of the Son of Righteousness, for they see the morning star. Note, we should be glad of everything that will show us the way to Christ. And there's so much more here. There is so much in this commentary. It's 6 volumes in the reasonable size print edition. There is a single volume complete edition, which is great when you're younger and have good eyesight, but otherwise you need a magnifying glass, and you also need strong arms to hold the 1 volume Matthew Henry. It's just a huge book. But here is a classic. Here's a book that we as Christians, we can really sink your teeth into. And you'll never read Matthew Henry and come away thinking, well, that was disappointing. You'll certainly never come away without having been pointed to the Lord Jesus Christ. He speaks about the transfiguration here in Mark chapter 9. The vision, being designed only to introduce this voice, when that was delivered, disappeared. Suddenly, when they had looked around, as men amazed to see where they were, all was gone. They saw no man any more. Elias and Moses were vanished out of sight, and Jesus only remained with them. And he not transfigured, but as he used to be. Note, Christ does not leave the soul when extraordinary joys and comforts leave it. Though more sensible and ravishing communications may be withdrawn, Christ's disciples have and shall have his ordinary presence with them always, even to the end of the world. And that it we must depend upon. Let us thank God for daily bread and not expect a continual feast on this side heaven. Or again on John 3:16. Here is God's love in giving his Son for the world, where we have 3 things. First, the great gospel mystery revealed. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. The love of God the Father is the original of our regeneration by the Spirit, and our reconciliation by the lifting up of the Son. Note firstly, Jesus Christ is the only begotten Son of God. This magnifies his love in giving him for us, in giving him to us. Now we know that he loves us when he has given his only begotten Son for us, which expresses not only his dignity in himself, but his dearness to his Father. He was always his delight. 2, in order to the redemption, salvation of man, it pleased God to give his only begotten Son. He not only sent him into the world with a full and ample power to negotiate a peace between heaven and earth, but he gave him, that is, he gave him up to suffer and die for us, as the great propitiation or expiatory sacrifice. It comes in here as a reason why he must be lifted up. So it was determined and designed by the Father, who gave him for this purpose and prepared him a body in order to it. His enemies could not have taken him if his Father had not given him. Though he was not yet crucified, yet in the determinate counsel of God he was given up. Nay, further, God has given him, but he has made an offer of him to all, and given him to all true believers, to all the intents and purposes of the new covenant. He has given him to be our prophet, a witness to the people, the high priest of our profession, to be our peace, to be head of the church and head over all things to the church, to be to us all we need. And one could go on. What a beautiful book it is. The prose is a little bit antiquated now. You've caught me stumbling over a couple of constructions, but that shouldn't put us off. There's a reason why this 18th century Bible commentary is still in print, and it is because it is just an absolute classic, and it will remain as long as the English language remains. Well, thank you for watching, and may God bless you and help you in your reading. Your reading not only of the best books, but the reading of the best book of all, the Holy Scriptures. Thank you for watching. May God bless you.